I think that will do it. All right, so a couple of things. Before we get into today's lecture, just close the door. So I have your grades updated. This includes the participation quiz and 7.8. So grades are up to date with everything. Just as a reminder, we'll have the quiz for 7B is going to be due this Friday. Or not Friday, but this Sunday, along with your case study. Okay? I've gotten a couple of emails with questions about the case study, and primarily questions about, should I use the case studies in the textbook as an example? I'm going to say yes, but the case studies in the textbook are good examples. However, they may not be long enough, or they may be too long. So that's the only recommendation. You shouldn't be using, I mean, obviously you're not going to copy and paste it and turn it in. But I would probably say the Massey coal mine case is a great example, but it's really long. I don't expect you to do that much research to collect that much data for the different shareholders. Okay, but I would recommend taking a look at the case studies in the textbook as a guide for what to do on your case study. Okay, having said that, does anybody have any questions or anything they would like to talk about in regards to the case study that is due on Sunday before we move on?
How many references would you say that we'd have to use outside of like the book and our personal knowledge?
I would recommend that you're probably going to need to use at least 4 or 5 external sources. I'm going to tell you right now, if you write a case study that has no external references, you're probably looking at about a C on the paper. Just because unless you are able to do an incredible amount of convincing that you know this material well enough to be able to speak from your own knowledge about all of the people involved and their perspectives and the things like that, I really see it being difficult to write this case study without at least 1 or 2 external references. My gut feeling is around 4.
For like the actual problem, or like bringing?
I'm talking across the entire overall of the paper. I would say that most of your references are going to be to support claims you make about the perspectives, knowledge, or behavior of the different stakeholders, right? Because you're going to tell me that here's the situation, here are the different people involved and what their perspectives are on the situation. And then here are the different ethical, here are the questions that I would ask from different ethical perspectives on how to resolve the problem. And so I would expect the majority of your references are going to be in that, here's what the problem is, here's what the perspectives are. Does that answer your question?
There are a lot of references in our own little story that we're making up, or that we're using.
Okay, let's say that one more time.
So we're not using, you don't really need references to back up like the story.
I would say that if you're using a real story from your field, if you can use sources to say, here's what actually happened and here's where you can find out more information, that would be fantastic. That would be very helpful. Some people are going to go with hypotheticals, and that's okay. But then you're going to need to bring in sources to help us to understand how you didn't just make this up for the sake of the assignment. Does that make sense? Okay.
when you say sources that we didn't just make this up, are you saying sources that prove that this is something that goes on in that field?
Yeah, I would want you to say, how do I know what sorry. How do you know what you know about the topic? So what I mean by that is, if you're going to say, here's the perspective of the business owner, how do you know that? How would we know that this is how companies think or act or do? Same thing with employees. The more realistic, the more based on fact we can get in the case study, the better and more useful the case study will be.
If it's a personal experience, do we need to know that?
Well, if it's a personal experience, you can talk about it from your perspective, but we have to understand that your personal perspective is going to be colored by bias. What bias? What bias would I have if this thing happened to me and I told you the story? What bias would I have in the story? Anybody?
Oh, I thought it was rhetorical. It's you possibly have personal bias based on your upbringing on how you see the situation.
Okay, so I bring in the bias of I only know things based on what I have experienced before, but also, how many times have we all experienced something where I could only see from my own perspective? I couldn't see around the corner and see what was happening, right? We are limited by our own sensory capacity in terms of what we can possibly know. So for example, when I'm talking to my wife, I can look at her facial expressions, I can listen to the tone of her voice and her body language, but at the end of the day, my assumption about how she's feeling about something is colored by my own bias, right? My previous interactions with her, how I feel about the subject, whatever information I'm transferring or attributing to her, right? We always have those situations where you sounded angry on the phone. Well, I wasn't. Well, you sounded that way, right? Okay, so attribution, us making assumptions about the feelings of others, can color or bias our perception. So my point with all of that, Daniel, is that the more I can bring in external information, it creates a greater sense of confidence about whatever it is that we are saying. So I thought she was angry, and then I asked her, and she said, yes, I'm pissed off. That's called triangulation, right? I'm using multiple pieces of information to guarantee that I understand what's going on as best I can. If I don't have those external sources, can I still do the paper? Yes, but it's gonna score lower because there is a greater likelihood of bias, which is gonna shift how we perceive the case. That's why we want to encourage you to use outside sources if possible to help improve and corroborate the things you're saying. Okay? Any other questions? All right then. So today we have moved on from chapter 7. We are done speaking about affirmative action. I was waiting to hear a little cheer from the audience. Okay, what are we talking about today? What is chapter 6 about?
Consumer risks.
Consumer rights and marketing, and ethical challenges related to consumer products and marketing. Why? Why are we talking about this?
the
'Cause it's-
ethics involved in selling products to consumers?
Okay, so we're going to be looking at ethical considerations or problems that can come from marketing to consumers. Is that it?
Maybe because it's something we kind of deal with on a daily basis. It's something that happens all the time in our society.
We're exposed to marketing all the time in all kinds of ways. And so it affects us as much as consumers as it can affect us as marketers. And so again, this gives us a great place to be able to consider, because we have a lot of general information about this, we can look at this from a whole bunch of different perspectives. We can look at some of the ethical challenges of marketing, okay, and how that might influence or interpret how we act in other situations similar to this, okay? So as I was going through the text, I identified some things that I thought would be of value in terms of discussion and debate. And one of the first things we looked at, or at least that I looked at, was this idea that advertising is criticized on the grounds that they rarely do more than give the barest indications of the basic function of a product, or basic indications of the basic function a product is meant to serve, and sometimes misrepresent and exaggerate its qualities. What does that mean? What does that statement mean? What is it saying?
That advertisements tell the truth, but not the whole truth.
Okay, why?
Because they want to sell.
Number one, because they want to sell. Okay, I'd accept that argument.
Maybe because there is some risk in buying the product they don't want to show.
Okay, so if we go for the more nefarious side, maybe they know that there's things about their product that they don't want to tell people because it would limit sales. Are there other reasons why?
Kind
You
of
know how
like,
to.
We got
I was
about,
gonna say, it's kind of like
Okay.
you give them just enough information to reel them in and sell them a product.
okay, because I know the more I talk, the less likely you are to buy. So I'm just going to get you enough information to tantalize you. Okay, Josh. That's what I was going to. Okay. Anybody else want to add on that? I know that there was somebody else that was about to say something. Okay. So based on those ideas or perceptions of why advertisers might limit the amount of information embedded in a marketing ad, do you agree with this statement? Most advertisements are designed to be as bare and surface as possible, and to give you only a hint as to what the reality of the product is. Would you agree with that or disagree with that?
I think I
agree.
would.
So I've got a couple of people that would agree with that. What significance would you attach to marketers if you think that's true?
Well, I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but I do think it could be useful to know that also the reason why they keep them so bare and simple too is because people rarely have the attention span or care to look at an advertisement for longer than 3 seconds anyways, so.
Oh, I think that that's a completely legitimate thing. Marketers know that our attention span is such, we're already interested in products that can help us avoid having to listen to advertisements, right? So the reality is, if I know that I'm only going to have a short period of time where an audience might pay attention, look, I have to make that marketing as effective as possible in getting them to look, right? And this gets into what Deanne was saying is, look, I just need to get you enough so that you'll come and take a deeper look down the road. Makes sense. Okay? Are there more positive reasons? Maybe not as nefarious about why advertisers might keep ads like this as brief as possible?
I don't know for sure, but I think they are paid for. They pay for how much time they take. So to cut cost on that end too, they might want to keep it short.
Exactly. That's a huge one, right? Most of the time when we do advertising, I mean, we're talking, if I put an ad up during, for example, Monday Night Football or the Super Bowl, we can talk hundreds, even millions of dollars for one 30-second ad. Okay? Therefore, I have to be very, very, very discerning about what I put in that 30 seconds because I've got to be able to put out as much information as I can to convince you to purchase whatever product or to investigate whatever service I'm offering. One of the things that I've seen that's been kind of interesting is a rise in a specific type of advertising, medical advertising. Does anybody else notice this? We've seen a huge increase in medical advertising. What am I talking about there? Richard.
You're referring to like the lawsuit ads?
Well, those are awesome. They're not the exact same thing, but they also include a lot of this. What are they trying to do? Lawsuit ads, yeah. Let's use those.
Is it related to the pandemic?
It's not necessarily related to the pandemic, but things like, have you or a family member been diagnosed with mesothelioma? Or has you or a member of your family been exposed to firefighting foam? Were you abused as a member of the Boy Scouts? Do you know what I'm talking about with these ads? Okay. Now, if you notice on those ads, they have the big title that says, has this happened to you? And then they have this entire half screen of tiny, tiny white lettering. Has anyone ever read what that lettering says? Anybody want to guess what it is?
Like side effects to if you buy the product, there's gonna be side effects to it.
Okay, so if I buy Eliquis, or gee, there's so many out there right now, right? But you've noticed, like for example, if you talk about Eliquis is a type 2 diabetes drug, if I'm thinking correctly. Okay, they have to outline potential side effects. Why do they have to outline potential side effects?
Because
It's
they're
a
legally
liability
required to.
agreement.
Okay, because they are marketing it to you. Part of their duty of care is to do what?
Inform you of the risk.
I have to inform you of risk before. Now, here's the interesting thing. Are they selling the drug to you directly? Why not?
Prescription.
Because these are prescriptions, you can only receive them if you receive a recommendation from a doctor. Well, so if I'm not buying this directly from Pfizer or whatever company it is, they're not selling it to me directly. They're just telling me, talk to your doctor about whatever product it is. Why would they still need to put all of that warning information about, if you take this drug, the harmful side effects can include A, B, C, D, and serious health risks, including death?
Because it's still their product.
Okay, because it's still their product.
It's almost like they're
They're
trying
the
to transfer liability to the consumer.
Okay, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit. If I can disclaim or identify potential risk up front, it eliminates any kind of responsibility for that outcome if it happens. If I've told you that you could die by taking this medication and you die, what happens? They can say, I told you that this was a possible side effect. I warned you before you took it. I cannot be held accountable for you dying if I let you know this is a potential outcome from doing this. Okay? I cut somebody else off if somebody else wants to hop in on that. Okay? The next interesting thing that I wanted to look at is the concept of the market approach. Can somebody explain to me what the market approach to sales is? What's the belief behind the market approach? What is the attitude? And this connects to one of our ethical perspectives. Let's start with what is the market approach?
I believe it said we could consumers could reward used vehicles as an example. If they prefer safety, they would buy more safe vehicles, and when producers see that consumers prefer safe vehicles, they would make their vehicles safer so people could buy more from them.
Okay, so it's the idea that what drives the development of products?
Demand.
Demand. And so therefore the market will respond to demand. And so in an optimal, perfect market, products will be sold because that's what consumers want. Okay, and so like this statement says, in a market, sellers will provide safety if what? If the consumers demand it, if they buy products that have higher safety ratings, what will tend to happen in a perfect market?
Other products will provide the same safety.
The natural movement will be if consumers are only buying safe products, producers will produce more safe product. Therefore, if consumers are not buying safe products, what will the market then do? They will decrease safety because people don't want to buy it, right? And so the idea is the laws of supply and demand should be the decider of the level of safety that should be present in products. This is in contrast to what? What did the book introduce as an alternative to this idea? The idea that in a market, sellers will provide safety if consumers demand it. What's the alternative to this? What's the alternative to the market philosophy?
Government interference.
Government interference, which says, for example, what?
Government would mandate them to make vehicles safe and give them all this bunch of rules.
Okay, so can you guys give me some examples of times where the government has required, regardless of market, has required safety?
With vehicle seatbelts.
Seatbelts is a classic example. Okay?
Asbestos.
Okay, what's that?
Asbestos.
Use of asbestos. Excellent.
The Pinto.
What's that?
The Pinto gas tank.
Okay, the Pinto gas tank. Okay, that one actually gets it actually came out not because of the gas tank location, but the government required vehicle manufacturers had to put their cars through what? Crash testing. We know that vehicles will get into accidents. We need to know how those vehicles will react to accidents, right? So originally, car manufacturers were only required to test front impact and rear impact. And they had to be able to be safe up to a certain mile per hour. right? So you put a crash test dummy into a car and crash it up to 35 miles per hour, front crash and rear crash, and then look at what happened to the impact dummy to make sure that it would protect the individual enough. Okay? That's when it originally started. And then consumers came, or consumer protection groups said, well, that's all good and well if you get into a front crash or a back crash, but what does that not test? Okay, so side impact. So now companies have to do side impact testing as well. Okay, so somebody brought up seatbelts. Are there other safety features that are now required because of government impact? Think about airbags as a classic example. Okay, now those are all safety features. Can you think of, and we're going to stick with cars for a second just because it's a nice, easy argument. Are there other features in a car that are affected by government law, not market demand?
Emissions.
Emissions? Emissions is a great one. Okay, anything else?
License plates.
License plates? That's not necessarily a vehicle thing. That's a government registration thing. Every time you go to the gas station, what are you experiencing? There's two different things there. When you put the gas in, normally you can choose between different fuel grades, right? Because the government requires them to disclose how much ethanol is put into the gasoline. Okay, and they have standards of how much you can put in, and that has to be disclosed. But I'm also putting gas in my tank because mileage. Is mileage something determined by the manufacturer? What do you think? They can decide how much mileage they want to build for, but they have minimum mileage standards that are put in by the government. Why? Why would the government have mileage requirements?
Because they could build cars that only last a year.
Okay, number one, because it could increase the likelihood that the car will expire quickly. But even more fundamental, has to do with emissions. Why would miles per gallon be considered the same thing as emissions?
Because if you have low miles per gallon, you're using a lot more fuel for a lot less.
Okay, and so I'm going to be putting out more emissions if I have low efficiency vehicles. So the government decided we, as a government, are going to put down that all cars must meet minimum mileage standards depending on what type of vehicle it is, right? So four-door sedans are going to have different mileage expectations than, for example, trucks. Why?
They just naturally get less mileage.
Okay, one more time.
Trucks just naturally get worse gas mileage.
Why? You're right, but why do trucks tend to get worse gas mileage?
Because of what they're used for?
Because of what they're used for. Because they have to have high torque, because they have to be able to pull and move heavy loads, we have lower gas or lower mileage expectations than we do for a car whose primary purpose is simply transporting humans, right? That's why your average sedan, your four-door sedan, these days should be averaging somewhere in the 25 to 30 miles per gallon range. Because the government said if we don't do this, then we can use less and less effective transmissions, which will increase gas emissions, which will affect the climate. Now, According to the market concept, how should we decide what mileage should be?
What consumers want.
What consumers want and what they're willing to pay for. If you want a high efficiency car, you're going to pay more for it. If you want a less efficient car, we'll charge you less because we're not going to have to make it, we're not going to have to use as many computers on it, right? We don't have to try to control things as much. That's what a market would do, right? That's all good and well, but how does that affect consumer behavior? What would likely happen if the government wasn't putting, for example, mileage requirements on cars?
I think people would just buy cheap.
People would buy as cheap as they possibly could. Therefore, manufacturers could make cars that were ridiculously inefficient because they didn't have, I mean, why are cars expensive these days? Because we have to use computers to test things like efficiency and things like that to get the miles per gallon that we expect. The inclusion of those computers increases the value, the cost of the car, which increases its price. According to market arguments, the government shouldn't have anything to do with it. It should be simply, if you want to have efficiency, you should pay for it. We'll produce it if people buy it, but we shouldn't be forced to have to do that. How do you feel about that? Liam, you're shaking your head.
I mean, I think it's a good thing that the government can step in and put some boundaries for because I feel like a lot of products will get out of hand if it was up to the consumers to like what they demand, because we would like them to want the cheapest solution, which will probably end up in having effects on other things.
Okay. Okay. Did you want to add something? No, please don't. Okay. Now, what makes this interesting is for example, let's look at the vehicle market. There are all kinds of examples of places where the government has said, we have to step in, regardless of what the market wants to do. The government says, we have to come in and override the seller's rights. What does that mean? The government comes in and overrides the seller's right. How do they do that? How does government override the seller and the seller's rights? We've just been talking about it.
For example, when they put a mileage in a car.
Okay, so the government comes in and says, we are going to regulate this by setting rules that if you want to sell cars, you have to meet these rules. If you don't, then you cannot sell. We're not overriding the consumer's right to buy, we're overriding the seller's right to sell. Now, we do that quite often in the car market, right? We've already talked, you cannot sell a car that doesn't have seatbelts. You cannot sell a car that does not have airbags. You cannot sell a car that doesn't meet minimum crash safety standards. You cannot sell a car that doesn't have minimum emission standards or mileage standards and such like and so forth and so on. You cannot sell, for example, a car without a safety windshield. Meaning, I can't just put glass in my windshield. It has to be a special kind of plastic, right? Why?
Prevent it from shattering when it breaks.
It's supposed to shatter in such a way that people will not be injured by the pieces of the windshield that are flying around through the air after an accident. People don't get to decide, I don't want that, I want glass, man. Nobody can do that, right? The government has overridden it. So if the government does all of these things, when it comes to cars, right, why does it do those things? Why do we allow the government to do that?
So we could be protected as consumers.
Okay, Because the argument is the market itself is not enough to induce manufacturers to do these things unless the government got involved. The manufacturer would just say the market shows people want cheaper cars, so we're going to make them cheaper, right? So if that's the case, and we accept or agree that the government should do that, let's look at another field. Let's talk about fast food. What do we know about the kind of food that is sold at fast food institutions and restaurants? It tends to be high in what? Fat, carbs, sugar, and salt. What do we know from science about those four elements?
Unhealthy.
They tend to be unhealthy, right? Therefore, it is likely that eating those things is going to have injurious effect on our health. So, let me ask you this question. If the government is entitled to put all of these restrictions and regulations on cars, why doesn't it do that on food, especially food that we know is likely to injure people? What do you think?
I think
Oh, go for it, Daniel.
I think with food is entirely up to us. Like I like the statement you made earlier that in a perfect market, the consumers would be able to, but it's not perfect because we are not professionals in vehicles, for example. Not everybody knows what each part or the benefits of having certain things in a car, what it does for them. So usually people stick to cheap. While fast foods are cheap, I think it still comes down to choice. Like you choose to go into that McDonald's store and get
Okay,
Mac.
that's true. But what if we were to, if science was to say that these foods are somewhat addictive, right? We have restrictions on tobacco because nicotine is addictive. So can't we make the argument that if the individuals in the market are not capable of making if they are not free from coercion, right? And remember we talked about this idea of coercion, that somebody cannot be free to act if they are being coerced. Could addiction be argued to be a coercion? Absolutely, right? I don't have the freedom to choose because my addiction is telling me or overriding my freedom to say, no, I do not want that bag of fries. Has anybody here ever seen So I Married an Axe Murderer? Oh, folks. Classic Mike Myers movie. At one point, his Scottish father is talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken. And that colonel with his wee beady eyes and his little smile that says, oh, you crave my chicken, you'll need it fortnightly. Oh, people. Oh, my best material is just being wasted. But this idea is that there's something in the Colonel's secret chicken, in his secret sauce, that makes it so you have to go and have most of us say no, KFC's not what I really go for, right? But there is something in the Coca-Cola that they sell at McDonald's that's different than any place else. And I defy you to disagree with me, okay? There is something in the Coke at McDonald's that's different than any other place. And so we go and buy it, right? Why don't we have, I mean, how many of you remember hearing about Mike Bloomberg when he was governor or when he was mayor of New York City, passed a law in New York City? Does anybody remember this? He outlawed
the soda slice
of soda over 16 ounces per serving. he outlawed big gulps. He said, we can show that sugar is a public health threat and that the sale of large sugary drinks is a threat to public health. Therefore, in the city of New York, it is illegal to sell drinks over the size of 16 ounces. Now, you can buy multiple drinks, each of 16 ounces, but you cannot buy the 32 or the 48 or the 96. Yes, there are 96 ounce mugs. Now think about that, folks. 96 ounces of soda. That's not a big gulp. That's called a spare tire. Okay? Why don't we restrict or regulate food the same way we do other products? Is the ethical argument different? Why?
Well, it's easy to replace the food you eat, but it's not so easy to replace the car you have. And with cars, like, a lot of the damage is more immediate if something were to happen. And
Okay.
like fast food is more long-term and over a course. And I don't think anybody expects that someone's going to eat theirs every day.
Sadly, I would say that statistics disagree with that. But I think you made an excellent point. Nobody has, wow, he was just drinking that big gulp and all of a sudden, man, his heart just clogged on the spot and he died. Right? Doesn't happen. Whereas if I'm driving a car that doesn't have those safety features, the likelihood or potential for death is immediate. Okay, I don't know if anybody else remembers this. Let me see if I can find this because I just always thought it was an interesting commercial. Hold on. It's a commercial against smoking. Let's see. There we go. Hopefully. Okay, share computer sound.
When you've got an extreme thirst, you know there's only one thing to reach for. A can of Splode. With 100 times the carbonation of ordinary soft drinks, Splode is intense. So if you think you can handle the pressure, grab a Splode and obliterate your thirst.
Does anybody else remember this commercial?
Yes.
I always thought it was funny just because I always got a kick out of the guy's voice. Grab a can of Splode. I always thought that was kind of funny. Okay, but what does this say? I mean, what was the entire point of that commercial? What was it advertising? It was against tobacco use by saying what? 1/3 of people who use tobacco, either smoking, chewing, or vaping, what's going to happen?
They're going to die.
They're going to die. Only one product is sold that kills 1/3 of the people that actually use it, and that's tobacco. Now, is tobacco regulated in the United States? Yes. How?
Age restrictions.
Legally, you're only allowed to purchase it if you're over the age of 18.
21.
Oh, it's a 21 now. Okay. I'm dated. I accept that. Okay. Why? Why do they put an age restriction on tobacco? What makes it harmful at 20 and safe at 21? Okay, who just said something?
Oh, well, if you're going for the age thing, it's more about a age of accountability, right? Like you're legally an adult at a certain age, so then it's like, okay, you can do what you want, even if it's going to kill you.
To hell with protection, man. If you want to die, that's fine, but you got to be old enough to take responsibility for it. Okay? Interesting that at 20, you're really not aware of what you're doing, but man, at 21, light up, right? It gets interesting, this idea of the market and what the market should allow and should not allow. So the argument, especially from people who support the market argument, is that government intervention is unfair, inefficient, and coercive. Okay, and we've talked a little bit about that. So then, in a market argument, who is responsible for the consumer? Who has to take responsibility for protecting the consumer in a market economy?
The consumer.
The consumer themselves. There is a phrase in Latin that basically translated is buyer beware. You as a consumer are responsible for your own choices. Therefore, no one else has to look out for you other than you. So then the book asks, well, if that's the case, where does the consumer's duty to protect themselves end, and where does the manufacturer's responsibility or duty to protect consumers begin? How would you answer that? From an ethical perspective, let's put ourselves in the place of the manufacturer. At what point do I have to start taking responsibility for the possible problems that arise from selling my product? What do you think? A little bit louder.
If you didn't inform the consumer.
Okay, I have a duty to inform consumers so that they can make an intelligent decision. Okay? A lot of people agree with that. What are some other things that a manufacturer might have the responsibility to do to protect consumers, other than just selling the product? Let's take a look at the second statement on this document. Sturdivant says that all products have to create 3 areas in which the manufacturer must retain responsibility. What does it mean to retain responsibility?
Like not passed off to the consumer. It's their initial responsibility to ensure that these aspects of the product are in order.
Excellent. These are 4 areas where the manufacturer has to keep responsibility. They can't just say it's on the consumer. What are those 4 things? Reliability. What else? Service life. Maintainability and safety. So let's talk about what those 4 things are. What is reliability?
How often it works as intended when you use it.
Okay, does it work like we said it would? Okay, so this product will get rid of any kind of limescale in your bathroom. It does that by dissolving everything, so you use it once and it dissolves all the grout and all your tile falls off your bathroom shower. Hey, I told you to get rid of the limescale. Does that work? No. Okay, service life, what does that mean?
Lasts as long as you said it would.
Okay, that it should have a reasonable life expectancy. Now, what does that mean?
It's not going to break down after the first use.
Okay, then I should be able to get a reasonable amount of use out of the product.
For example, food.
What's that?
For example, food, if it's like, if you can date on the package.
I need to be able to put down a date by which it's still safe to use this product. It's sell-by dates, right? So that a customer isn't going to go and buy milk that has expired. Okay? I think we're also talking about, for example, the life cycle of a car should be more than a year or two. This should be a durable good. It should last a while. Begs the question, are cell phones considered durable goods? Should they last for a while? Well, then how do I argue the fact that there's a new iPhone every 6 months? How does that deal with service life?
Well, that's not so much that it stops functioning after a certain time. It just kind of gets outdated.
Okay, so how would you then address Apple's concept of programmed obsolescence? Have you ever heard of that term? Basically, that iPhones are designed to stop functioning at optimal levels after a certain period of time. The batteries, which are integrated into iPhones, you can't replace iPhone batteries, are designed to wear down so that after a certain point they cannot be restarted. What does that suggest? Why would they do that?
So they can sell more in the future. So let's say, for example, like the iPhone 5 right now, they technically are discontinued. So then that whoever has like an older iPhone will be like, oh no, I have to buy a new phone because technically everyone nowadays wants a phone or needs a phone, and that's how Apple makes more money.
Okay. So why isn't anybody calling Apple out on this? Why wouldn't they be able to just say you've designed this product to fail just to force people to buy a new one, not because it wore out, but because you don't want them using the old phone?
Didn't Apple get sued for that specific reason in the UK?
They did, but they won the case. Apple won the case. How could they have possibly won the case? What's the argument that would justify this? Casey, go for it.
Fine print for liability at the end of the agreement.
Okay, that's one huge one. Fine print, we're going to talk about that. Well, I don't know if we'll get to it, but we'll try. That's one thing.
Consumers demand.
Well, but what about the consumers who didn't want to have to buy a new? Look, I spent $600 for this phone. I want to use it until I can't use it anymore. And you built in features that will cause it to die. This isn't just it wore out, it's you designed it to wear out. You put code in there. Does anybody know what Apple's argument was? Apple made the argument that after a certain period of time, the hardware inside the phone could no longer keep up with security threats coming from outside they could not update the software anymore. The hardware couldn't handle it. Therefore, the hardware was making the phone vulnerable to exploits if you kept using it after a certain period of time. So so what? What does that mean? Josh, you're shaking your head. What does that mean?
I mean, they're using the argument that they're trying to protect us as the consumer.
Because you're not going to stop using the phone until I physically have to make it stop working, in order to protect your safety, because I am considered responsible for that, I actually have to make this phone fail, or you'll keep using it well outside the safety date. Okay. Don't know if that is actually the best argument I've ever heard, but that's the one that Apple went with, and they won. Okay? Maintain, and this gets at that idea of service life and maintainability. They had to end the service life because they could not maintain the security of the device the way that they had warranted that it would be, right? Apples are famous for being secure devices. You don't hear about viruses on Apple phones on iPhones to the same degree that you hear on other mobile devices. Would you agree with that? Okay, so in order for us to maintain maintainability, we had to implement service life restrictions. Okay? All right. Now, last one we're going to have, okay, there's something I want to do really quick, so let's take a look at this very last statement. The view that sellers should provide a great deal of information for buyers has been criticized on the grounds that information is costly and therefore should itself be treated as a product for which the consumer should either pay or do without. Can anybody think of an example of this? The argument is sellers have an obligation to disclose information that will affect the sale, and they should give the buyer all the information they need to buy something. The criticism is information is expensive, and if people want that, they should have to pay for it like they pay for anything else. Can you think of a situation where that is the case?
Carfax?
Carfax, exactly. Okay, explain to me this idea of Carfax, Christy.
So it pretty much has the history of all the vehicles accidents and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to obtain that information, you have to pay a fee.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so what's the argument here? What is the expectation? What is the deal with Carfax? Why should that matter? I was hoping you were going to pick this one up. Anybody, why is it a big deal about a Carfax? Why should that matter when buying a used car?
So you have the full story. Maybe the car was in an accident or something, and the dealer's not too keen to disclose that information.
Okay. Classic example, a car's been in a flood. That cuts the value of the car automatically in half. Anybody know why?
Rust.
Rust and salt getting into the system of the car can destroy the car, but is it immediately visible to the naked eye? Absolutely not. The only way you know a car had been involved in a flood is if somebody discloses that fact. I can show that the fact that the car was involved in a flood significantly changes its value and its long-term maintainability, right? So people are arguing every used car dealer should have to provide a Carfax for every car it sells. That way people can make an informed decision about whether they should buy the car. How does this statement address that? What position is this last statement arguing? Should car dealers have to disclose a Carfax?
Say no, but if you want it, you have to pay for it.
No, because information is costly, and just like anything else, if you want it, pay for it or do without it. Okay. What challenge does that provide or suggest? A Carfax is a pretty straightforward question, right? You either pay 30 bucks and get the Carfax or not. And if you're planning on paying $10,000 for a car, should $30 for a Carfax be that big a deal? No, but people act like it is. They don't worry about the $10,000 car loan, they're Carfax. What do you think? What about the ethics of this? Should I be required to disclose everything? Or should I be allowed to be able to tell people, if you want it, you need to pay for it? From an ethical perspective, what do you think? Anybody? Okay, let's keep that one. So what I'd like to do for the last part of class is I would like to take a few minutes and I'd like to watch a video about a very famous court case. Happened in 1992.
Howdy.
Hold on, actually.
In Albuquerque, New Mexico, an elderly woman was severely burned when she spilled a cup of McDonald's coffee in her lap. An 81-year-old woman.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Can you guys hear this? Daniel? Okay.
In Albuquerque, New Mexico, an elderly woman was severely burned when she spilled a cup of McDonald's coffee in her lap.
An 81-year-old woman has been awarded $2.9 million after she sued McDonald's, claiming their coffee was too hot.
Stella Liebeck spilled just 8 ounces of coffee, but she attracted a flood of attention. The jury's awards set off a media frenzy and became a rallying cry for those who believed our legal system had run amok.
I think it's absurd.
But as her story cycled through newspaper headlines, talk show storylines, and late-night punchlines, one thing was lost: the facts.
This story is the most widely misunderstood story in America. The public perception of it is Stella Liebeck won a lottery. She bought the coffee, she spilled it on herself, and now look, she's a millionaire. When, of course, the facts are much more complicated than that.
Stella Liebeck was a 79-year-old widow sitting in the passenger seat of a parked car when she was burned on February 27, 1992. She had recently quit her job as a department store clerk and moved to Albuquerque to be near her daughter.
The day that the burns happened, my mother and my nephew went through the drive-thru at McDonald's and got breakfast and coffee, and they pulled into the parking lot. And in the Ford Probe, there's slanted surfaces everywhere. There's no place to put the coffee. She put it between her knees and lifted the lid off. And in the process of doing that, spilled the coffee, and all of the hot liquid went into the sweatsuit that she was wearing and pooled in the seat.
All I remember is trying to get out of the car. I screamed, not realizing I was burned that bad. I knew I was in terrible pain.
The severity of the burns caused Stella Liebeck to go into shock, and her grandson immediately took her to the emergency room.
She was burned over 16% of her body. 6% of the burns were 3rd degree. She was in the hospital for a week.
Medical bills were $10,000, so Stella reached out to McDonald's and asked to be reimbursed.
We couldn't believe that this could happen over spilling the coffee. So we wrote a letter to McDonald's asking them to check the temperature of the coffee and to give recompense for the medical bills. And the response from McDonald's was an offer of $800.
Stella Liebeck had never sued anyone before Albuquerque attorney Ken Wagner took her case. Before they went to trial, they tried twice to settle out of court, but McDonald's refused.
We bought a product, it was used as intended, it was unreasonably hot and therefore unreasonably dangerous, and those were the essential facts.
I was not in it for the money. I was in it because I wanted to bring the temperature down so that other people will not go through the same thing I did.
McDonald's policy was to serve coffee between 180 and 190 degrees. That's about 30 degrees warmer than most home coffee brewing machines. A burn expert testified that liquid at 180 degrees could cause 3rd-degree burns within 15 seconds. lawyers produced documents that showed that between 1983 and 1992, nearly 700 people claimed that they had been burned by hot coffee at McDonald's.
McDonald's was on big time notice that they had a product that was dangerous and it was burning people. We argued that to the jury, that they were callous and indifferent in simply not turning down the temperature.
An expert for McDonald's testified that burns are exceedingly rare, one for every 24 million cups of coffee served.
They just said it's statistically insignificant, and we're not going to change what we do.
People interact with hot beverages all the time in a fast food restaurant, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the restaurant is doing something wrong.
Attorney Tracy Jenks tried the case for McDonald's and argued that Mrs. Liebeck bore personal responsibility because she spilled the coffee on herself, and that McDonald's coffee wasn't any hotter than the coffee at other fast food restaurants. She said the reason the coffee was so hot was because that's what customers wanted.
McDonald's had a really, really strong reason for why they brewed their coffee at the temperature they did. It was an industrial standard based on the maximum extraction of the flavor and the maximum holding temperature.
But the jury saw how liquid at that temperature can scald when they were shown graphic photos of Mrs. Liebeck's burned groin.
The photos depicted where they had to graft the skin from the side of her legs to close the third-degree burn. And I think if people would have seen the severity of the burns, they would have realized it was not a laughing matter.
After 7 days of testimony and
Howdy.
4 hours of deliberation, jurors came up with a comprehensive answer to a complicated case. They unanimously agreed to award Stella $200,000 in compensatory damages, but because she caused the spill, they reduced that to $160,000. Jurors set punitive damages to send the message to McDonald's to turn down the temperature of the coffee.
I remember I could see Judge Scott going like this with his pencil, and I thought, oh, I hope he's counting digits on the verdict form. And he was.
They based the amount on the revenue from 2 days of coffee sales, $2.7 million. The size of the award got the media's attention, but it overshadowed the rest of the story. Details of the case and the facts related to how the jury made its decision went mostly unreported.
Several days after the verdict, I had news crews from France, Japan, Germany.
So let's talk about this for a second. Okay, we have consumer rights and we have seller rights, correct? So Liebeck in this case said that the ethical responsibility for her burns lies in who? Who's responsible for her burns? McDonald's. Why?
Because the coffee was too hot?
Because the coffee was too hot, because it posed a reasonable danger, and because we're looking at this and that many people have been burned by this coffee. Okay? How would you respond from the seller's perspective? Right, we heard their attorney saying, look, everybody sells it this hot. This is not something that we did. This is something everybody does. Josh.
You saw in the video there was a warning label on the cup that cautioned that hot contents.
Okay, okay, so one could argue Liebeck should have realized. She had the coffee between her legs, right? She takes the lid off, all the coffee spills on her. Okay? Now, in this case, the attorney showed the pictures of the burns, which were pretty gruesome. I probably could have gone without seeing that. But that was his point. Look, this is not just some person that was haphazardly just kind of scalded. This is a person who had pretty significant third-degree burns. What do we think? What's the ethical expectation for McDonald's? The obvious thing would be what? Turn down the freaking heat. So why didn't they?
Because consumers wanted it hot.
Because other consumers wanted it hot. That's one. Because that's what the industry was doing. We're not going to sell it colder than everybody else and get a reputation for cold coffee.
Also, the fact they were like one in, I think when the numbers, it was like 1 in
24 million.
Yeah.
Only one person gets burned for every 24 million cups of coffee sold. It's statistically insignificant. There's not enough people getting harmed by this to justify having to change it. Almost sounds like the Ford argument in the Pinto case, right? It's cheaper for us to pay off all of these suits than it is to change the temperature of the coffee. Anything else?
Didn't they say that like they had science backing that heat was necessary to pull out the right amount of flavor and like resting heat?
Yep. And because I'm selling this to go, I have to have it hot enough that by the time people actually drink it, it's still going to stay warm enough, right? I have to try. We already know food, when it's sold in fast food, cools off over time, right? The entire purpose of the product, the expectation is it's hot coffee. Therefore, I have to serve it at temperature so that it stays that way long enough for you to consume. Okay, let's keep thinking about this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in class on Thursday. Okay, does anybody else have any questions before we call it a day? All right, that's everything I've got, folks.